By 1967, the relationship in the household between Ted's parents and Assia had become so dire that Ted suggested Assia and Shura move back to London. Ted was absorbed in his writing and several other literary projects, including early in 1968 working with the director, Peter Brook, on a version of Oedipus for the National Theatre. In the autumn of that year, Ted's parents returned to Yorkshire. Although Assia didn't move back to Court Green, the idea seemed to be that she and Ted might find a house together away from Devon and from relatives. In March 1969, they were still looking, this time in Northumberland, but with no success. Assia then returned to London. A few days later, deeply depressed, she gassed herself and their daughter in a way that was horribly reminiscent of Sylvia's suicide. Ted writes to Assia's sister, Celia Chaikin.
I should have written to you long ago, but I felt so absolutely smashed and not capable of talking to anyone about what has happened. I've gone through these last weeks in a daze. Everything has become horrible to me. I cannot believe how I never knew what was really happening to her. Our life together was so complicated with old ghosts and dozens of near separations over the years. But we belonged together so completely and so deeply that her repeatedly testing me, saying that we'd better separate for good, were just like a bad habit, part of our old difficulties. And so, when she repeated it on that last day over the phone, there was nothing new, nothing we hadn't got over dozens of times before. I feel now my life has gone completely empty. I know if I had only moved, if I had only given her hope in slightly more emphatic words in that last phone conversation, she would have been okay. But I was totally exhausted, nearly off my head with other distractions. Usually, one of us could pull the other out of it, but on that day, we were both exhausted. And then she acted so quickly. If only she'd gone away for a week, anywhere, she'd have jerked me out of my apathy and confusion. Little Shura was the most wonderful little girl, full of fire.
Meanwhile in Yorkshire, Ted's mother, Edith, was in hospital. In May 1969, she died. This loss, so soon after the appalling deaths of Assia and Shura, left Ted reeling. In the spring of 1970, he wrote to the Israeli poet Yehuda Amichai, whom Assia and he had met and befriended, about Assia's death and about the genesis of the poems that were to become Crow.
After Assia and Shura died, I did not know how to write to anybody. I carried your letter around unopened. I carried her sister's and father's letters around unopened. I was just paralysed. And I'm still not much improved. I've been swallowed up this past year. I made a move to get away, and of all the places, I moved to a house that she and I once tried to buy. I haven't written anything for a year. I was writing a long series of poems about a crow being, a sort of saga that puts this crow through all sorts of extremes. At the absolute nadir, it dragged me into a great depression, and Assia with me. And then the thing happened. So I have this depressing collection of poems about a crow.
Crow was eventually published on the 12th of October 1970 and dedicated to the memory of Assia and Shura. In August that year, Ted had married Carol Orchard, the daughter of a local Devon farmer, and he decided that they should set up home at Lum Bank in Yorkshire. In September, Gerald and his wife came over from Australia to visit them. Ted was clearly traumatised by the events of the previous years, and his behaviour was erratic and unpredictable. Later, he tries to explain himself to his brother.
This last 6 months has been the bitter end of this last 2 years. From the age of about 16 to 17, my life has been quite false. And since Ma's death and Asei's, this false arrangement has been falling to pieces with great drama. Finally, I think I've reached the end of it, where I can begin again. Not easy to describe and probably not interesting. It's left me in a strange state, feeling I now have to begin again from scratch in myself. I imagine I've now reached the end of it and that everything appears to me in quite different terms. The hellish feeling has lifted off somewhat and I'm getting active again. It has meant the end of all sorts of dreams. Temporarily, I hope. Anyway, I'm now getting going, and my aim is to build myself up to the point where I can once again live in a home in a decent spot and live the enviable life. As it is, all I can manage is a very confined arrangement of things, where working comes first. Putting everything before my writing is just what caused all my disasters.
Much of 1971 was spent in Paris and then Persia when Ted was working again with Peter Brook and his actors. That autumn, the Hughes moved back to live at Court Green, a house in the end that Ted had been unwilling to let go. Frida and Nicholas were settled in boarding school in London, and Devon provided them with a familiar home for weekends and holidays. In 1972, Ted and Carol acquired a small farm, Moortown, 6 miles from their home, and began to stock and run it with the help of Jack Orchard, Carol's father. Writing to the poet and translator Michael Hamburger, Ted seemed sanguine about the positive impact farming was having on his writing.
Since we last met, I got this opportunity and decided to go the whole hog. I bought a farm. So far, it's proved to be the best decision I've so far managed, just about, though incredibly expensive. Carol's father, who was a farmer, manages the whole thing, actually. All I do is struggle to stay uninvolved, though inevitably I spend a great deal of time on it. The whole thing is too interesting to resist. It's reconnected me to the only world I belong to in any way, which I felt I was beginning to lose. And so far as I can judge, it has helped my writing, mainly by making it impossible for me to gad about and showing me the real precious value of each hour, which I did not learn 20 years ago, as I should have done.
The reconnection Ted talks about here is a return to the world he'd known and understood and loved as a child. There is a sense not lost on him that he may have come full circle. When he was 19, Ted wrote a poem, Song, which he referred to emphatically decades later in his 60s as
the one song I sang in Arcadia that came to me literally out of the air, utterly unaware of all that lay ahead. O lady, when the tipped cup of the moon blessed you, you became soft fire with a cloud's grace. The difficult stars swam for eyes in your face. You stood, and your shadow was my place. You turned, your shadow turned to ice. O my lady, O lady, when the sea caressed you, you were a marble of foam, but dumb. When will the stone open its tomb? When will the waves give over their foam? You will not die, nor come home. O my lady, O lady, when the wind kissed you, you made him music, for you were a shaped shell. I follow the waters and the wind still, since my heart heard it and all to pieces fell. which your lovers stole, meaning ill. O my lady, O lady, consider when I shall have lost you, the moon's full hands scattering waste, the sea's hands dark from the world's breast, the world's decay where the wind's hands have passed, and my head, worn out with love, at rest in my hands, and my hands full of dust. O my lady.
Richard Armitidge read a selection of letters by Ted Hьюз, to be published in full by Faber and Faber this week. The Ted Hьюz letters were presented by Jane Fiver and produced in Manchester by Susan Roberts.